This episode contains discussions and descriptions of violence against women. Listener discretion is advised. Over here, we're obsessed with all things Maputo Protocol.
Hello. This is the podcast where we discuss all things Maputo Protocol. I'm Grace Marwa-Pattison, and on behalf of the Solidarity for African Women's Rights Coalition, welcome back to our second series on advocacy, coalition building, and transformative feminist action to end violence against women. Last time, we were in Banjul, where we explored the ins and outs of the African Union system to hold governments to account for their promises to end violence against women under the Maputo Protocol, which is the African Union's Women's Rights Treaty, and one of, if not the most, comprehensive in the world. This episode will be focusing on how the Maputo Protocol responds to violence against women and girls in conflict settings, particularly through Article 4 on dignity and integrity, Article 10 on women, peace and security, and Article 11 on protection in armed conflict. But beyond this legal framework, I want to understand, what does this actually look like in women's lives? Or perhaps, what does its absence look like? Today, we're in Sudan, a context where the realities of conflict have had devastating impacts on women and girls, and where violence is being experienced on multiple levels, from the home to displacement settings and areas of active fighting, which has been ongoing since April 15, 2023, almost 3 years. Sudan is also a particularly important case when we think about the Maputo Protocol, because it is just one of 9 African states that have not yet ratified the protocol. That means the strong protections it sets out, including the right to dignity and freedom from violence, and specific obligations for states to ensure women's participation in peace processes and to protect women in situations of conflict, are not yet legally binding at the national level. But at the same time, women's rights organizations, including SOAWR member, the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, or SIHA Network for short, are on the ground, documenting and responding to violence, supporting survivors, and strengthening protection systems in extremely challenging conditions. So today, we're not only looking at the realities of violence, but also at the strategies, solutions, and leadership emerging from women on the ground. And I'm grateful to be joined by not 1, not 2, but 3 guests from the SIHA Network to help lead us through this big discussion. We have SIHA's Regional Director, Hala Al-Karib, SIHA's Coordinator of Regional Consortiums, Susan Labwot, and finally, SIHA's Leader of the Survivor Network, Ikhlass Ahmed. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
So great to have all 3 of you here. And amongst the 3 of you, we have so much expertise on the podcast today. But you are not just armchair experts, observing from afar. You have also been personally affected by this conflict in Sudan. So before we dive into the meat of today's discussion, I wondered if we could take a moment to hear about your own stories of this conflict.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you have said it absolutely correct. We are also victims of this conflict. We have also lost our homes. We have lost all our belongings, and we have lost family members. And our communities has been deeply scarred by the impact of this war, and we have been displaced. Many of us have lost their livelihoods, probably forever. They would have never gained it. So the damage is quite significant. And in a way, we have also been mentally and psychologically impacted, and this is happening while we also, as a women rights defenders, institutions, as activists, and as feminists, and as women at the front line, we are also expected to be on our feet in terms of responding to the crisis. So it's quite complex situations that we found ourselves in. So I think I will stop here, and maybe Ikhlass, if she would like to shed light on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. So, yeah, for me, this war is not something I study from a distance. It's like something I have lived and continue to live. So, I'm from Darfur. And then, yeah, but like since April 15th, the scale and brutality of this conflict has changed everything. So my own home in El Fashir was held, and then after the events in October 2025, so my people there, so they have been targeted because of who they are. And then before that, my mother was attacked, kidnapped, and injured. So I have also received threats. So at one point, like I have to evacuate my family and also to evacuate my mother for protection. So when I speak about the conflict, about displacement, about the collapse of protection system, I'm not speaking abstractly. I'm speaking as someone whose life has been shaped by this war. So and that's why I'm continue, not because it's safe, or just like I'm continue working, not because it's safe, not because it's easy, but because silence would mean accepting that this violence is normal for us. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe just to contribute to what my colleagues have said, personally, I'm from Uganda, from northern Uganda, and in Lamour district specifically. And my home district is very close to South Sudan. And during the 25 years of the LRA war in northern Uganda, I can really, the experience we did have, and looking at the experience that my colleagues in Sudan right now are having, is extremely vivid. When I look at some of the protection strategies that we are currently applying and how we are working to support the frontline workers, it is something that is not so strange and not foreign, because for those period of time that my community also went through that, it's something that that your home will never be the same. And I can imagine that my colleagues from Sudan, that the loss of properties, the loss of homesteads, the loss of relations, and the loss of even the smallest dignity of any young woman, of any young girl, it's something that cannot be recovered as an effect of war. So so as a form of direct effect, and as a form of work, and what my colleagues are going through, and also the experience that some of us who are working together with them have gone through, really make us identify and and work with them from a perspective not just for program, but from a very sensitive understanding of what the war in Sudan is having and what the prolonged effect will have.
Thank you all for sharing. And to get us started into the meat of today's topic, perhaps I could start with you, Hala, to ground us. When we talk about violence against women in Sudan today, what does that look like in everyday life for women and girls? I'm wondering, perhaps, is there a particular story or moment that has stayed with you and captures the reality on the ground?
Well, first of all, it's really important to emphasize that this particular war in Sudan, it's absolutely centralized around women bodies and women existence, overall existence, and most importantly, it's clearly targeted, without any shame, the women's agency and our capacity to have a voice and to have a say. I'd just like to remind, our listeners that only 5 years ago, Sudanese women particularly have led a protest that has brought down one of the very cruel and brutal dictatorship in Africa, that has been in control of Sudan for over 30 years. And 60% of the protesters, 60% of those who were on the streets, who toppled the regime of al-Bashir at the time, were women. And I remember after the military coup that has happened, and even during the protest, we could see the signs of women being specifically targeted, and we have collected testimonies of women who clearly spoke to us about being told by soldiers that, while they were being assaulted or sexually assaulted, that this is happening to you because you are on the public space. This is happening to you because you are on the streets. What are you doing there on the streets? So the whole idea, is to push women back, and to shame them and to take away their agency. And by virtue, that will take us to the idea that this is the war against our voices. It's a war against our human rights, a war against our right for democratic governance. It's a war that aimed at dominance, at suppression of the Sudanese people. And it was orchestrated in that way, and this is why women were the center of it. So we can speak about all forms of violence against women that's been applied in this war. Sexual violence is the most prevalent crime that was perpetrated against women across Sudan, with no exception. But Darfur specifically, the sexual violence is an extension of over, half a quarter century of crimes, of sexual violence crime that was committed against women. It's very painful, to see generations of women, a mother and sometimes a grandmother who either re-experience this horrific violence, of sexual violence, and then see her daughters and granddaughters experiencing that. So that for me was the most heinous, the most ugly situation. And I think this is happening mostly because, the abandonment and the neglect. I think the crisis in Darfur was what the first reason and the main reason that this war is happening in Sudan, because the mishandling, the neglect of the acts of genocide that has been happening, the enabling of the flow of arms, seizing of the African Union mission that has been playing an instrumental role in monitoring the violations in Darfur. All that has led to the expansion of the conflicts and also enabling the perpetrators, because the lack of justice and accountability, the nature of political settlement, which tend to promote perpetrators and glorify them, and give them green light to continue with their atrocities. That's all has led to where we are. And the fact that violence against women and sexual violence in particularly has never been taken seriously or dealt with accountability as we are engaging in political processes, as the male elites, driving the political process, of course, with other international countries who doesn't care about what's happening to us, who doesn't care about our bodies.
Thank you, Hala. The reality you're describing, especially the heartbreak of intergenerational experiences of sexual and gender-based violence against women, it's just awful, and it expounds on SIHA's most recent report, which is called More Than Numbers, where SIHA described the violence against women as systematic, intentional, and deeply gendered. And you've also shed light on the types or patterns of violence being perpetrated. Susan, are there forms of violence that remain invisible or perhaps underreported?
I think just to add on what Hala has said is the fact that most often when we hear of what is happening on of the war, it's usually surface reporting of what is actually happening. So the media has reported more on the arms, more on where the war is, but the realities and the specification of how the war is engendered most often is missed out of this reporting. So things to do with really some of the horrific acts that are done on women and young girls, the forced disappearance of many of the young girls, these are often not reported, neither are they documented for us to clearly have the statistics, for us to have the evidence, and to challenge or have any form of accountabilities on those statistics are often lost or left out within the bigger scope of reporting. Sometimes also when the media report, the angle from which the perspective of the war is reported and the effect on the women is also not re-emphasized. More is we focus more on the political scope of the war, but we do forget to understand that politics is very personal. And the fact that women's bodies are being used to justify the political intent, and this is not re-emphasized, makes it a war that is, that is not mirroring the realities and is leaving women who are the majority survivors or those who are majority affected by the war, left out of any repatriation or any form of accountability that should be emphasized.
Absolutely. And I think that also speaks to why the work that SIHA and other feminist organizations and movements in the region carry out is of the utmost priority and necessity. And SIHA continues to recenter Sudanese women and their experiences at the global level as well. Hala, you just recently gave your third statement at the UN Security Council, in which you highlighted violence perpetrated against Sudanese women by the Rapid Support Forces and other armed forces. So I'm curious from your perspective, what role do armed actors but also institutions play in either enabling or failing to prevent violence? For example, how has the African Union responded?
Well, I think, it's it's very interesting. I have listened to the response from the A3, which, it was empathetic and everything, but it's also the despite the fact that we have the Maputo Protocol, which is clearly speaks about, sexual violence and other forms of violence and forms of gender-based violence against women and girls as central in the continent's stability and as central when it comes to women's dignity, and participation in public life. These concepts has never structurally made it like, to the principles of governance across the African um, continent, if I may say, presumably, but the countries that I know of, where we are working in SIHA. When it comes to Sudan, Sudan signed the Maputo Protocol, but they never ratified it. And I think that's something that we will never stop pushing for, but not only the ratifications. What's most important is how, the issues of women dignity and the concepts of accountability is integrated into the principles of governance. And that's a huge challenge because the military institutions in our countries is enjoying, endless impunity, a lack of accountability, in terms of the violation that they are committing against civilians, but particularly against women and against children, underage girls, and women of all ages and ability. So there is this hidden impunity, which is, it always push for the fact that it's okay if women were harmed. That's a minor issue. That's a personal issue, that's a peripheral issue. It's fine if women were harmed. It can be always pushed to the margin. And this impunity that men with guns are enjoying, it's very central, in my view, in the destabilization, and the poor governance that we have in our part of the world. It doesn't mean that other parts of the world, they don't have impunity. They do have. We see that clearly. But for us as African, as a continent has suffered in the pain of colonialism, we should do much better as a continent who accumulated, decades of liberation and narrative. We should do much better towards our own people, and towards, towards the civilians, towards the women, and towards the children. And so internalizing, the wars of colonialism practice by disregarding, violation that are committed against women. It's a huge shame. And it's very unfortunate, because also the African Union is consistently sideline and undermine what women, are enduring during conflicts, being in Sudan or in South Sudan or in Somalia or in the Congo or anywhere, anywhere where women are subjected to these violations, and men with gun have, enjoyed endless impunity.
Thank you, Hala. For highlighting all of that. So I just also want to add, so at the regional level, the African Union has suspended Sudan's membership since the 2021 coup, and it has issued statements calling for ceasefire and dialogue, but the statements are not enough when women are being raped, abducted, and killed. And suspension alone doesn't protect the woman working to collect the water. And also, like, the diplomatic language doesn't stop armed men at checkpoints. So the African Union has powerful tools at its disposal. It has the Maputo Protocol, as Hala mentioned. It has the Peace and Security Council. It has the continuatal early warning system. So they also has the authority to mandate investigations, to apply political pressure, and to coordinate protection response. So the issue is not about absence of frameworks, it's the absence of decisive action. So the AU also has positioned itself as a guardian of African solutions to African problems, but African solutions must include protecting African women. If the continuatal body that adopted one of the strongest women's rights treaties in the world, it cannot respond decisively when those rights are being violated at scale. So then we must ask difficult questions about political will, because for Sudanese women, this is not a diplomatic crisis, it's a survival crisis, and survival cannot wait for slow decisions yet.
Yes, and on that note, in the More Than Numbers report that I mentioned earlier, which, by the way, I highly recommend our listeners to go and check out, another SIHA colleague of yours, Adla Abu Bakr, said that whether Sudanese women remained in their homes or were displaced, There was no safe environment for them. Survival was often a matter of chance rather than the result of any functioning civilian protection systems. So, can you talk us through where the biggest gaps are in the response and protection systems currently, whether that might be legal, medical, or psychosocial? And what happens to these survivors when there's simply no functioning system to turn to?
So the biggest gap is that in many parts of Sudan, especially in Darfur, the system has collapsed completely. Legally, there is almost no access to justice. Courts are not functioning. Police stations are destroyed or controlled by RSF in all over the Darfur. So in some areas, so reporting sexual violence can actually put survivors at further risk. So what happens? Crimes go undocumented, and then also in areas like Zalinge, perpetrators are walking freely. Survivors are left with silence instead of justice. Medically, so the situation is devastating. Many health facilities have been destroyed or looted, and again, so survivors of rape often cannot access post-rape care within the critical 72 hours window, meaning to emergency contraception, no PEP for HIV prevention, no forensic documentation. That's not just a service gap, that's a life-altering failure. So women are displaced, actually, traumatized, grieving, and still responsible for holding their families together. So there are very few trained counselors who provide psychosocial support. Left support is largely being provided by under-resourced women volunteers and grassroots organizations. Survivors are coping with repeated trauma in overcrowded displacement camps, often in the same spaces where perpetrators circulate freely. So what happens when there is no functioning system? Yeah, simply survivors return to each others, they return to women-led groups, they return to informal protection networks, they return also to community-based responders who are doing the work without salaries, without protection, and without sustainable funding. And that is the most dangerous consequences, the normalization. So the absence of response is not, it's not neutral. It sends a message to perpetrators that they can't continue, and it sends a message to survivors that their pain doesn't matter. So that's why, for me, and ratifying frameworks like the Mobutu Protocol is not symbolic. It also creates binding obligations, and it's strengthening accountability. It gives women tools to demand protection. So right now, Sudanese women are building protection from the ground up, but they should not have to replace an entire state system while under bombardment. That's the gap, and that's the urgency we need here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really want to echo that before I ask my next question, that it's not the responsibility of civilians to fulfill these gaps. And having said that, we know that feminist grassroots organizations like SIHA Network, even though it's not their responsibility to fill that gap, they are stepping up and they're stepping in where these systems are failing. Can you perhaps share some examples of these creative or community-led protection approaches that you've seen or been a part of?
I'm just going to very briefly uh, speak that about how frontline feminist organizations and networks on the ground are stepping up, but they are also bearing the burden and collect the pieces, and at the same time they are exposed to enormous threats without protection and without any support. Women rights defenders and activists are, and this is something we have seen since the beginning of the war, Many of our colleagues have enforcibly disappeared. We don't know where are they. Some of them are detained, and we have nowhere to reach to them, or understand their conditions or what's happening to them. We have colleagues who are detained in RSF controlled territories, which is quite horrific. And we have also documented many cases of frontline respondents who are exposed to harassment, but sexual violence. We have seen women rights defenders have frontline workers who were punished by perpetrators, particularly by RSF, for responding to the victims of sexual violence by themselves being violated. And taking for granted frontline defenders and women rights, while the international community and the overall aid and humanitarian aid institutions is relying on those frontline workers without taking responsibility of providing them with basic protection tools. It's such a shame, but this is what's happening. We have to endure significant risks as we are doing that. So that's really very, very important. And I'm going to ask Ikhlass to respond to the type of services and intervention that we have been engaged on over the past 3 years.
One example is the feminist community kitchens we have been part of. On the survey, they respond to hunger, and of course, hunger is severe. This kitchen, they are much more than food distribution points. They are protection spaces. So these kitchens are run by women. They create structured gathering spaces where women can safely meet, exchange information, identify risk, and also they refer survivors of violence to trusted support networks. So in contexts where there is no functioning police system, no social services, and no safe reporting mechanism, the kitchen becomes a protection hub. So we have also supported informal survivor networks, a small cycle of women inside camp who identify new cases of sexual violence and connect survivors to medical care, even across borders when necessary. So these networks operate quietly, often without funding, but they are life-saving. Another approach that has been community-based documentation. So the SIHA, we are trained the women there to collect testimonies ethically and safely, preserving evidence for future accountability, even in displacement areas. So even under threat, where women understand that documentation is power, it says this happened and it will not be erased. So we have also seen creative psychosocial support using storytelling, drawing, small group discussions, and culturally grounded healing practices when there are no formal mental health services available. Sometimes healing begins with simply being believed. So that's what SIHA and our grassroots organizations in the ground doing. And importantly, these initiatives are not imposed from outside. They are designed by the women living the reality. They are also flexible, discreet, and rooted in trust. So when we talk about feminist grassroots organizations stepping in, we are talking about charity. We are talking about community-led protection architecture built under bombardment, sustained by solidarity, and driven by the belief that even in war, women deserve dignity and safety. That's feminist resistance in practice.
Yeah, wow. I think that really captures the essence that we're often hearing about Sudanese women as victims of this conflict. But we know that they are certainly not passive, as we've been hearing throughout this episode. And as Hala mentioned earlier, women having been 60% of those resistors and protesters to the previous regime just 5 years ago. I'm sure our listeners will recall those powerful images from that time, and particularly of student activist Ala Salah leading calls for revolution from on top of a car. So if women survivors across Sudan could speak directly to African leaders and those in positions of power, well, firstly, Hala and Ikhlass, what would you like to say personally? And what do you think other women survivors would want to say, having worked so closely with them throughout this entire conflict?
Actually, I want to answer this through the story of a woman I met in Adre camp. She had been raped multiple times during the attacks in Darfur since 2003, not once. So, and also like it wasn't an isolated incident, but repeatedly. So, as part of a bottom of terror. So, when I sat with her, she didn't ask for sympathy. She asked one question: how many times must this happen before someone acts? Um, that's what survivors would say to African leaders. They would say, we are not numbers in reports, we are not background noise of to political negotiations. We are African women whose bodies are being used as battlefields. They would ask, you adopted the Maputo Protocol. You committed to dignity under Article 4. You committed to protecting women in armed conflict under Article 11. You committed to women's participation in peace and security. So where are you? Where is the protection mechanism? Where is the pressure on armed actors? Where is the accountability for conflict-related sexual violence? So survivors would say, don't issue a statement, take action. Fund women-led organizations directly, support independent investigations, and create real civilian protection mechanism. And most importantly, they would say, we don't want your pity, we want your political courage, because silence is not neutrality, silence is complicity. So Sudanese women are watching. Yes, yeah, that's what they are going to say to them.
Really powerful. Thank you so much. And I'll come to our concluding question, which I'll open up for everybody. This is the All Things Maputo Protocol podcast. And as we've been discussing today and weaving throughout, I wonder whether the reality on the ground in Sudan would have been different if the Maputo Protocol had have been ratified by Sudan, because it calls for both the specific protection of women in conflict, to live freedom of violence, and particularly violence within conflict, as well as women's participation in peace processes. And it characterizes this as essential, not something to have on the sidelines. So, in your eyes, what does meaningful implementation of these articles of the Maputo Protocol look like in practice? And perhaps where countries have ratified it, such as in neighboring South Sudan or others, do you see any difference in how these commitments translate into women's lived realities?
I think, having Sudan ratified and integrated and domesticated the Maputo Protocol, maybe we wouldn't have been in this situation. And I'm saying that if the protocol articles were meaningfully integrated into the policy and legal framework, one of the biggest crises in Sudan that our governance system has remained for a very long time systematically discriminatory against women and girls, and actively criminalize women and girls under a very cruel and religious-based criminal act that basically works systematically to exclude women from public spaces and to repress communities So I think, if Sudan's subsequent regimes has been open into the spirit of Maputo Protocol, into seriously the articles of Maputo Protocol being integrated, because it's not only about the laws, but it's about the overall constitutional existence of the state itself. If the Sudanese state is fundamentally accepted that it's a state that based on equality and respected the diversity. But I think, the elites has consistently resisted a commitments to any framework that would hold them accountable to diversity and to equality, particularly to gender equality. And I think this is this is the result that we are living through. Now, when it comes to South Sudan, I think it's amazing and great step that South Sudan has ratified the Maputo Protocol. The challenge is also to understand that it's not about the ratification, but it's about reflecting, the spirit of the protocol on the system of governance. And I hope that South Sudan will take notes of the decades of armed conflicts in the past and of what's happening in Sudan and what's happening in other countries who are struggling with conflict at this point in time, that there is no way, to attain stability without respecting and acknowledging the rights of women and accepting and accommodating, the diversity of the nation states. Yeah.
Yeah, just to contribute to what Hala has said, how different is it, and in other countries that have ratified, and do these commitments, are they translated to the lived realities of women? I say to some extent, we could say it is, because having a legal foundation on which you can argue rights, you can argue accountability, is a starting point. And while other factors, internal and external, do influence how the states implement these commitments, very crucial, but also the reality that we have, that countries who have ratified have something to solidify their argument on. And I could say, for example, in Uganda, since 2010, when the country ratified the Maputo Protocol, there has been quite a number of advocacies. We struggled with the payment of dowry and the effect on women, and there were quite legal contestation on this, and the Maputo Protocol was one of the bases on which the legal arguments were made. However, as Hala do highlight, that the will and commitment to translate those commitments into lived realities is something that most young states are challenged with, and those that have ratified the protocol. Rebuilding post-war requires a multi-layered approach. It's complex. So when some of the states have put in reservation to critical articles of the protocol, that adds on to an extra will and the ability for the states to allocate resources equitably and inclusively to rights, and also for the states not to choose which right to within the protocol to commit to, and which right to make a reality for women, because we are affected in very different aspects. When you talk of economic empowerment, we are affected. When you talk of education, ownership of properties, women are affected. So all these rights are interlinked, and so reservations here is something that has weakened the ability of many of the states to translate these commitments into lived realities.
100%. Thank you all for your insights. And there's so much more to dig into here. I mean, we're just touching the surface of it. But SIHA Network, you should go and check out their website after listening to this episode. It's full and rich of resources to learn more about also how to get involved yourself or into any of the advocacy campaigns as well. It's rich with documentaries, reports, important statements to really wrap your head around. So I do encourage you to check out SIHA Network's website. I also want to thank our listeners. We invite you to catch up on our past episodes and continue with us in this series. You can follow us along via our website at SOAWR.org and all of our other social media platforms. And the resources mentioned throughout this episode can also be found in our show notes. And of course, a huge thank you to today's guests, to Hala, Ikhlass, and Susan. Thank you for your time, for your vulnerability, and your powerful stories and messages.
Thank you. It was
Yeah,
fantastic.
thank you.
And just to conclude, we like to finish in a language other than English here on the All Things Maputo Protocol podcast. So could you help me to translate, how do you say end violence against women in Sudan in Arabic?
القضاء على كافة أشكال العنف ضد النساء والفتيات في السودان.